The book of Daniel is an amazing book, and we're going to spend perhaps a little bit more time. I've tried to keep these videos between 10 and 15 minutes, and this one might spill over. We'll see how good I am at sticking with the format. But the book of Daniel is pretty incredible, and so we want to take a look at it from a couple of different perspectives. The first one is how it reads as an example of God's sovereignty at work. So, in spite of the fact that God's nation is destroyed, in spite of the fact that Jerusalem has fallen, the temple has been destroyed, the gold has been taken, everything is lost. It is a picture of, even though the conquering king is strong, God is more sovereign, more worthy to be respected than any earthly king. So it reminded me of the poem Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survived, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." It's interesting to read the stories of these world-conquering kings like Nebuchadnezzar, like Cyrus, like Sennacherib. And so they come and they go, but from generation to generation, the sovereignty of God remains. So that's kind of the background of the story that we want to watch unfold in the book of Daniel. Before I get into taking Daniel chapter by chapter and talking about what's there, I wanted to quickly take you to the Oriental Institute in Chicago. It's one of my favorite places to visit whenever I get a chance to go to Chicago. It is filled with Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian artifacts. In fact, a couple of them that I like, one is a black obelisk that has a picture of an Old Testament king, Jehu, bowing to the Assyrian king. And anybody at that time could have looked at that black obelisk, looked at the face of the king who's bowing and said, "That's Jehu," which means this is perhaps the only known caricature of an Old Testament figure that we have in that black obelisk. And then if you go right through the doors, at least when I was there, into the gallery, and you turn and look at the wall that you just passed through, there is a relief of Babylonian eunuchs serving King Nebuchadnezzar. So you can see Nebuchadnezzar, and you can see faces of some of the eunuchs serving the king. And you can tell that they're eunuchs because they do not have beards. And it makes you think, that was Daniel. That could have been his three friends. So this may well be the forum in which Daniel lived out his life in the service of King Nebuchadnezzar. Also at the Oriental Institute, you can walk right by these two lions. These two lions come from the promenade, the main street, up to the palace. All the parades, all of the business traffic would have gone up and down every day. And probably Daniel passed those exact same lions frequently, doing the king's business, going up and back from the palace. Perhaps you are looking at the same things that Daniel would have looked at. Pretty incredible. So let's talk a little bit about how Daniel is constructed. The book of Daniel starts with an introduction. Daniel chapter 1 is sort of an introduction to the whole book. It explains how Daniel gets to Babylon and what's happening there. And that section, interestingly enough, is in Hebrew. But then in Daniel chapter 2, Through Daniel chapter 7, the book switches languages, and it goes to the trade language of the ancient Near East, which is Aramaic. And so chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. So we have Hebrew, and then we have Aramaic, and then the prophecies in detail switch back to Hebrew. And so Daniel is an interesting book. You can tell who the audience is. If this passage is primarily written so that Israel knows what its God is doing among the kingdoms of the world, the passage is written in Hebrew. But if the message is for all nations to know about the sovereignty and the power of God, then the book is in the section is in Aramaic. So you see all of the stories that make good flannel graph presentations for little kids in Daniel chapter 2 through 7. Those are for all of the world. They're written in Aramaic. But the treasure for Israel in knowing what God is doing kingdom by kingdom, generation by generation, that is written in Hebrew. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to walk through each of the chapters. And as I said, I don't know how long this is going to take, but I hope that it's a help in helping you to understand what God is doing in the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel begins with that captivity and judgment, the capture of Daniel and other of the fine youth of Israel being deported to Babylon. So they're choosing out certain people for a noble work, a training for the king's service. They needed to be handsome. They needed to be without physical defect, and to appear to have at least an aptitude for every kind of learning, to be well informed and quick to understand, because the goal was to learn the language and literature of Babylon in order that they might understand and absorb and teach the culture of Babylon, so that peace could result, friendship could result, instead of continuing animosity between conflicting cultures. And so this was the training program for Daniel and his friends. Daniel, of course, wants to remain a faithful Jew in the midst of a pagan king's administration. He knows the dietary restrictions. He is trying to be faithful. And as he wins favor with his mentors, he and his three friends, by the end of Daniel chapter 1, are regarded as 10 times better than their competitors in this king's administration. And Daniel and his three friends will now play a prominent role in the administration of Babylon for the rest of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. In fact, Daniel will say, I remained in Babylon from Babylon until the reign of Cyrus, which means Babylon has fallen and Persia is now the world power. That's Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 2 begins with that dream of Nebuchadnezzar, of the mighty statue that is, as it turns out, succeeding kingdoms of the world, succeeding empires. It's interesting when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, he won't tell anybody what the dream is. And he does that because we have already seen in other contexts how false prophecy works. O king, so tell us the elements of the dream and we will interpret it for you. In other words, we can manipulate the message once we know what the message is, but the king Nebuchadnezzar decides, I'm going to wait and I'm going to have you tell me the dream, and if you can tell me the dream, then I'll know the interpretation of that dream is true. So the king looks at his dream and sees it as so significant that he's willing to kill off all of his dream interpreters, all of his advisors, if they cannot tell him the dream and the interpretation. Daniel is able to interpret the dream, and he tells the king what those pieces are. The head will be Babylon, is Nebuchadnezzar, and then the silver chest is Medo-Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome, and then there is that lacks some explanation. There will be a troublesome stone that comes that destroys the nations of the world by striking at the end, the feet, and bringing the whole thing tumbling down. And you and I, from a New Testament perspective, can guess who that stone is. Daniel chapter 3 seems to indicate that Nebuchadnezzar looked at that statue, saw it as something great, and decided he will be the whole statue. So he built his man out of gold and used it as a raw demonstration of his power and his unity. And Daniel's three friends stand up against that need to bow and to worship the false god, this statue that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And it's interesting, Nebuchadnezzar is furious, and then he is even more furious. And you listen to his words as he's trying to explain to them, please bow to the statue. Because he says, what God will be able to save you, to deliver you from my hand? No other God can save in this way, but Nebuchadnezzar hasn't met any other real gods. He has only met, or is about to meet, the Most High God. And his knowledge of who God is grows until we have that letter in Daniel chapter 4. No other God can save in this way, and so probably this picture represents the kind of furnace that was the one in which Daniel's friends were thrown. So they would put a ladder up to the chimney, the top part, and then they would throw you down in, and then there would be a window on the front where you could watch your pottery or whatever was being baked to see that it's finished. And in this case, you could see the men, but instead of seeing them burn, seeing their torment and their pain, you see three men and the fourth man walking in the fire who looks like a son of the gods. And so they have to cool the furnace down and get the friends out. And Nebuchadnezzar gains respect for the God who delivers his people from the hand of the world conqueror Nebuchadnezzar. In another place, we've recorded in more detail the story of Daniel chapter 4, but here's the story of what we've called the gospel according to Nebuchadnezzar, in which Nebuchadnezzar comes face to face with the God that, even though Nebuchadnezzar has done great and mighty things, Nebuchadnezzar must bow his head to the king whose sovereign reign extends from generation to generation. So we've already said the king usually writes of great victories, but Nebuchadnezzar found it necessary to talk about the one signal failure in his life and to send out a letter to all the nations of the world to bring them greetings so that they would know the Most High God with whom he has come to a new understanding of who that God is. Daniel chapter 5 then moves on, and Nebuchadnezzar now has moved off the scene, perhaps passed away. His son is actually Nabonidus, and Nabonidus has chosen, he likes to worship the moon god more than take an active role in daily administration of an empire. And so Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son, is the king at the fall of Babylon. The walls of Babylon are surrounded by a Persian army, and a siege is going on, but Babylon is so big, so vast, so powerful that Belshazzar has no worries about the army that's sitting outside. And in fact, he throws a party, and he calls for showing the strength of Babylon. So they go and they pull the elements that have been taken from the temple in Jerusalem to poke fun at the conquered gods of Babylon including the Most High God. And so there is drinking and rebellion and debauchery, and a finger appears and writes on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which being translated is weighed and divided. So he does not honor the God who holds his life in his hands, and there is this promise of the end of the kingdom. It's interesting, there in this story, there's a queen mother who shows up, and the queen appears to, it's possible that this is Nebuchadnezzar's wife, and she remembers all of what happened in the older generation, and the king has forgotten, but the queen has not, and she knows where to go get Daniel. Daniel interprets the dream. He is rewarded with the third ruler. It's third because Belshazzar is 2, because Nabonidus is 1. But outside, the history tells us that the Persian army has dug a trench to redirect the Euphrates River from flowing straight under the walls of Babylon. And if you redirect a river so that it goes around another way, there's a hole in the bottom of your wall. And the army is in, and that night, in one night, Babylon falls. That's Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 6 is the story of Darius, who is king of Persia, and new friendship beginning to grow between Daniel and Darius, and Darius is trapped by his wicked counselors, his jealous counselors of the integrity of Daniel, and so he makes a foolish decree, and the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. And so, try as he might all evening, Darius cannot get a way out for what he has now looks like going to cost him his friend. And so Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, and then the next day, when God has rescued Daniel from the lions, those people who had conspired against Daniel, their family, and they are thrown into the lion's den, and it says they don't even reach the bottom of the den before they're torn apart. So that's the part that ends sort of the biographical section of Daniel. So we go from the biography of Daniel 1 through 6 to the prophecies of Daniel 7 through 12. So in just a few minutes, let me walk you through the prophecies of Daniel as they appear. So Daniel 7 has Daniel's dream, which is much like Nebuchadnezzar's dream, only instead of the different sections of a very human statue, there are 4 different beasts, one after the other, but they are the same kingdoms, the same empires that rise and fall. It's the same dream. The first animal is a winged lion, which that picture is an animal, a kingdom which displays real speed and real power. And it is a kingdom, this animal has a heart like a man, which might be a reference to the conversion, or at least the newfound respect and understanding that Nebuchadnezzar has for the Most High God. So the winged lion is replaced by a bear, but the bear walks funny, and that is an indication of a confederation of unequal powers, Media and Persia, beginning an empire on their own. Then we have their connection to, the third one. Then we have the winged lion, then we have a bear, then we have a leopard, which is the swiftly running empire, quickly spreading empire of Greece under Alexander. And then he dies, and the empire is divided up among its 4 generals, the 4 horns. And then there is another beast comes that is unlike anything in the natural world, which represents Rome. It is more crushing in its military power and exploitation and repression. But of course, there is this little horn which rises up in that nation of Rome, which is boastful, aggressive, waging war against the saints. And then that whole system comes down, and we're suddenly taken into the presence of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. Now, pay careful attention to that description of the Son of Man, because that was Jesus' favorite term of self-designation, right? So you're reading the gospel, and he says things like, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. And we thought it was a great picture of the humility of Christ in wanting to identify with us. But I wonder if he's referring to, notice the Son of Man in the book of Daniel and look for me as the fulfillment of that Son of Man, because that Son of Man is led into the presence of the Ancient of Days, the Father. He is worshipped by all men, and he is given the sovereign power that, again, the nations of this world and the kings of this world have been coveting. The Son of Man is given that kind of power. Then we have Daniel 8. Daniel 8 doesn't talk about Babylon, and it doesn't talk about Rome. It focuses on the two middle kingdoms that we've been talking about. You have Medo-Persia, which in this case now is a two-horned ram, and then we have a goat. And the goat has a large horn, which is Alexander the Great, until the large horn breaks off, and four horns succeed the great horn. And so you get a picture of those middle kingdoms, and the kingdom of Alexander is going to result in its rebellion reaching full measure in the rise of, and Antiochus Epiphanes is predicted there as the sort of a figure of perhaps someone who might come much later, playing his part in biblical prophecy. Daniel chapter 9 is Daniel's prayer that God would, when the 70 years ends, remember his promise and fulfill that promise to his people, in spite of the fact that his people have not wholeheartedly embraced God and desired his favor again. So Daniel will pray, we do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. Daniel chapter 9 also includes this prediction of 77s, which begins with a decree to rebuild the temple, which in Daniel's time has not begun yet. That is a part of the return stage. There would be 7 sevens used to rebuild that temple, 62 sevens until the appearance of Messiah, and then it says the end will come like a flood. So we'll leave it to a prophecy class to help unwind what that has to say. But Daniel chapter 9 is very significant in studying biblical prophecy. In fact, here's a chart that might give us some help, give us a clue as to how those weeks lay out. Daniel chapter 10 is more of Daniel's consuming desire to know what is going to happen to his people. And there is, as it's pictured, a spiritual warfare in the heavenlies, as the answer to Daniel's desire is on its way, and there is a war to get that information to Daniel and to God's people. It's interesting, the name that they use to describe Daniel is, Daniel, you are a man who is highly esteemed in heaven. Man, if you're going to be esteemed, that's where you want to be esteemed. That's Daniel chapter 10. Daniel chapter 11 focuses again on some of that which falls out from Greece. We have a description of Alexander, and then those 4 horns talks about the Ptolemies, Antiochus, and the persecutions that Antiochus would bring about. The last one, the last chapter, is very interesting because it reminds me of a couple of different New Testament passages. In Matthew 24, we have a passage that talks about Jesus' prophecies of the future, and it begins with the disciples asking Jesus when Jesus says there's not going to be one stone left upon another in Jerusalem. And the disciples ask, Lord, when will all this take place? What will be the outcome? It's almost like the question that is asked in Daniel chapter 12, when Daniel gets visions of what the future might look like, and he says, I heard, but I did not understand. And he asks the same question, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? And God says, I'm not telling you. It reminds me of 1 Peter, where it talks about the prophecies, the prophets of the Old Testament desiring to look into all the things that God has revealed, but it's revealed to them that the prophecies are not for them, but for a later time. But they desire to look into all those things, and that's what's happening in Daniel. Daniel wants to know, so what is the outcome of all this? And God says this in response, as for you, go your way until the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. Isn't that interesting? Daniel's picturing what we see in 1 Peter, that the desire to know what predictions of the future and how that will all fit together. And God says, it's not for you. Go your way, you will rest, but at the end of the days, your personal eschatology is assured. At the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. So there we go. Took more than my usual 10 or 15 minutes, but I hope the walk through the book of Daniel has been profitable. Thanks for listening.